Now, let me talk a little bit about the choices that we made in lining up the lectures that you'll be hearing from over the course of the semester and in selecting the readings. Although some of you have taken courses in American International Relations theory before, none of you have taken a course exactly like this one. This is not designed to be exhaustive. It's not designed to be comprehensive. It's not designed to provide you with an academic background in IR theory, but to give you instead enough of a variety of perspectives on how the world works today to provoke you to think, and to think independently and to either form or hone your ideas and opinions about how the world works today. What we want you to be able to do is not memorize the positions of various theorists, but to think critically and analytically, to formulate and advocate policy positions that are informed by the best of modern and contemporary social science. So some of this is garden variety IR theory, for those of you who've already had that, and in fact the readings that were assigned for this week are largely written by and about garden variety IR theory. But much of what we'll be reading is not that. Much of it is in different fields. Much of it is from different disciplines. Outside political science, we look at material from all sorts of social science disciplines, from policy advocates to very scholarly academic authors. This is designed, as I suggested, to make you think, and it's designed to make you think by forcing you to engage with some of the great minds of the past and present, as they themselves struggle with compelling international policy issues. So part of this is to have you argue through with people who themselves are arguing through how to understand the world. Many of the writers that we're going to be reading over the course of the next 13 weeks are struggling to understand how their world works. Because once they can understand how their world works in their own estimation, they can start advocating policy, what we would call policy. But first they have to figure out what makes this world look the way it does. Why are some people powerful and other people not? Why are some organizational forms privileged over others? Why do conflicts seem to be endemic in some places and not in others? How do you think about inequality? How do you think about prosperity? How do you think about fairness and equity and justice? Those are the kinds of questions that these writers are trying to struggle with. And we designed the course assuming, I think correctly, that these are the kinds of ideas that you struggle with, that you care about. And we hope that you'll learn in the course of the term from each other as you battle the arguments that are being made by the people you read and the people you listen to with each other, and from the variety of perspectives that they bring and you bring to these issues. So there are, in a sense, 3-4 different elements to how this course works. It's who you read, who you hear, and who you sit with in class. You are yourselves part of the design of the course. You bring different experiences, you bring different perspectives, you bring different educational backgrounds, work backgrounds, values, things that you care about. All of those will go into the mix as each of you tries to hone your ideas about the way the world works. After several introductory weeks, in which you will be wrestling with reading Western social theorists from Hobbes and Locke to Marx and Weber, this is the hard part. This is the slogging through the dead white men part. And I think that's important, and I think it's valuable, and difficult as it is. And the reason why this work is interesting and important, and I urge you to take this part seriously, difficult as it is that when Hobbes and Locke were trying to figure out how the world worked, or when Marx was trying to figure out how the world worked, or when Weber was trying to figure out how, this was at the beginning of the modern era in which we live. And in some respects, they were living in times of dramatic change, not dissimilar to the time we're living in now. And they were trying to figure out a world that was changing before their very eyes. And they were trying to figure out how it worked and what was important and what kinds of dynamics characterized this world. So in a sense, we're going to be reading them for two reasons. One of which is they were actually pretty smart at figuring that out. And some of what they saw resonates through the centuries to today. But also to watch these minds trying to figure out how their world works. Because in modest ways, you ought to be doing the same thing. You ought to be thinking about what it is that makes this place tick. Where is power? Where can you get leverage for the change you want? How does the world with new technologies, with the kinds of changes that we're seeing now, how is it going to shape your careers? So you need to be thinking to some extent in the same way that they were thinking, with the same sorts of ambitions. So think about, when you do that reading, both those things. What did they say, but also how did they approach trying to figure out their worlds? But don't worry, this is not a course on the history of Western political thought. As I say, we read these ancients, and they are in some respects, because they wrote at the beginning of our own era, and they wrestled with issues we confront today, including very dramatic social and political change. But then we go on to explore more contemporary theory about things like the causes of war and the theories that underlie efforts to promote peaceful dispute resolution, the nature of foreign policy making, of international efforts to promote prosperity through trade and aid. Will it be exploring the origins of the modern state, the corollary notions of states and citizens and rights and identities? Where did these things come from? Says who? Why are we organized this way? Why do we privilege citizenship? What is citizenship anyway? So before we start advocating rights for citizens, perhaps we should know where this idea of citizenship came from. You'll be introduced to a very small sampling of the vast literatures about these kinds of questions. Some of it the conventional wisdom, some of it very critical. All of this is designed, the emphasis on critical analysis, on articulate and informed advocacy, is designed to make you better at what you're going to do. And that brings me to one of the most important of the general points I want to make today. And that is that all public policy is based on a theory, or several theories. Sometimes the policymaker knows the assumptions that he or she is making, and sometimes he or she is not that self-conscious. But all policymakers, all people, have assumptions about how the world works. All people have theories that help them organize the facts which assault them daily. All of you have theories with which you organize your interactions with each other, your assumptions about how a class will work, your assumptions about how a school operates, not to say the larger world that you are intending to pursue professional careers in. You all have beliefs about what motivates human behavior, about what causes conflict, about how we should measure value, about what the rights of citizens should be, about how identities are formed, and many other things. You have beliefs about those. We could poll you now, and everyone here has an opinion, a theory about these questions. But the chances are pretty good that you don't actually know where these ideas come from, or what alternatives there might be, even within this room. So I may have a view about how to measure value, but there are probably dozens of other views in this very room, not to say in the world as a whole, about that, about how we might do that. We collectively at SEPA believe that public policies are made better by people who recognize their assumptions, that is, know what those theories are, acknowledge their theoretical predispositions, and most importantly, embrace their normative implications. That means you have theories about how the world works, and on the basis of those theories, you also have preferences about how the world should work. That's as it should be, and we want you to be more self-aware, more self-conscious about both your theories and your preferences. We happen to think, as you can well imagine, that Columbia is a particularly good place to do that because it's a great research university and you have access to some of the world's most distinguished academic theorists of international affairs, some of whom will be arrayed before you over the course of the semester. So that in addition to the skills and knowledge you'll get in other courses, here you will be exposed to analytical perspectives that should make you a more sophisticated and more confident policymaker. And you'll be able to recognize what it means when somebody says that somebody's a liberal theorist or a realist theorist. And know, and this is important, it makes the reading much easier when you realize this, much of the language we use is jargon. Technical uses of everyday words. So when we say realist, or we say rational, or we say efficient, we don't necessarily mean what you would mean by those words if you were talking to your uncle at the dinner table. These are we use them in technical ways, and part of what we're going to be doing over the semester is making sure that you understand that vocabulary. It's not magic, it's not mysterious, but it makes everything much clearer once you do understand that vocabulary. So we'll ask why policymakers advocate democratic politics. Is there a theory behind democracy that is desirable? Or why they celebrate or abhor globalization? Or why they predict war in certain circumstances? What they mean by those terms, what they expect by those phenomena. And most importantly, and this is one of the reasons why we want you to participate in your section, do you agree with them? When you hear a policymaker advocate a particular position, do you agree? And if you do, why? And if you don't, why not? By the time you're finished with your time at SEPA, if not by the time you're finished with this semester, you ought to be able to answer that question. As I suggested, most policymakers, particularly in this day and age, are reasonably well aware of what their theories are and who else shares them. But keep in mind that that's actually, in the larger scheme of human history, relatively new. For many of what we would call policymakers over the course of human history, rulers of various kinds, they learned the theories about human nature and about what was right and wrong and so forth and so on, more from their families than from any formal education. Increasingly, policymakers reflect a formal education like the one that you're embarking on now. And in fact, both kinds of education, both kinds of backgrounds are visible on the world stage today. There are some people, in fact many people, whose policy prescriptions, whose vocabulary, whose view of the world, whose understanding of how the world works reflect exactly the same kind of formal education that you've been lucky to have so far and are going to continue over the course of the next 2 years. But there are a few people, and I will give you an example, for whom that is not the case. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya is a very acute psychologist in the world in which he was raised. A world of tribal identities where kinship trumps bureaucratic position and where reciprocity and barter are as powerful as any stock market. The underlying theories of human nature about markets, about the character of prosperity, about morality and responsibility, and about government that come out of that world are in full view in his manifesto, the Green Book. So should you want to see an example of political theory born of an experience that is virtually completely bereft of formal education in a policy school, you can look at Gaddafi's Green Book. For him, as still for some other world figures, and for many, many ordinary people in the world today, and I think you need to recall that, globalization, whatever we mean by that, but whatever the consensus about globalization is, it represents a bizarre and alien phenomenon, bringing in its wake a complicated jumble of the tempting and the odious. At the other end of the spectrum are people like, and I choose these for reasons that will become apparent, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, a very well-educated policymaker. Or, for that matter, the ex-president of Tanzania, also a very well-educated policymaker. Both of them did graduate work at Columbia. Even if they are not always and completely self-conscious about the theoretical foundations of their policies, the marginal utility theory of value that underlines capitalist economics, the liberal conception of human nature that encourages support of democratization around the world, their grasp of the complexity of globalization, however they ultimately assess it, reflects familiarity with ideas that animate it. They're privileged by the ascendancy of the assumptions in globalization that are familiar and congenial. So there is a privilege in the world today for people who are familiar with its language, understand these kinds of ideas, are educated in its terms, as you are. If you will permit me to remind you, anyone who got into this room is among the privileged, not only materially, but intellectually. You who are here already, even before you finish this course, are among the intellectual and policy elite of the world. You know more, see further, and have more responsibility than the vast part of humanity, now or ever. And among your responsibilities, it seems to me, are self-consciousness and awareness of the limits of your knowledge, empathy for those who see the world differently, and willingness to engage in constructive criticism. That's what this course is designed to encourage you to do. Now, a little about the readings. The readings are, for those of you who have surveyed the syllabus, very heavily weighted toward American theory. American authors, American policymakers are vastly overrepresented in this syllabus. Now, we could assign Gaddafi's Green Book. It's certainly assigned in universities in Libya. But the assignments in this course are largely from the Western canon and current American academic scholarship and policy analysis. That's partly because you've chosen to come to an American university. You could have gone to school in Libya. And the curriculum will reflect where we are, as I think it should. But it's also partly, let's be candid about this, American hegemony is not only political, but intellectual as well. You aren't in Libya for a reason. Americans produce a disproportionate amount of the rationalization of the world system from which they disproportionately profit. Now, whether this is right or not is part of what I hope will animate your discussions for the next semester. This is for us all to debate and for you individually to decide. But I think it's part of why we design the course the way we do. It's to give you that canon, some critical perspectives on it, and then to require you to debate that with each other and with yourself. This course should give you an opportunity to examine your own assumptions, to strengthen your own self-consciousness about the theoretical traditions your policy positions reflect, and to make you, therefore, a more acute analyst and advocate. The readings for this week are designed to do several things. To outline a variety of the perspectives on international relations in American academic and policy circles today. These are representative, and if any of you have taken an IR course, these will be familiar to you. They're certainly not exhaustive, but they give you as good a taste as you need. They're also designed to encourage you to read analytically, to begin to distinguish between normative argument, how things should be, and descriptive or empirical argument, how things are. Those two are very different, and they're often conflated. And the more you can distinguish as you read, as you argue, as you write yourself, between description and normative argument, the stronger your description will be and the stronger your advocacy will be. They're also designed to encourage you to read critically, finding points you agree with and disagree with, and then thinking about what the implications of agreeing with this particular argument might be for other arguments that are related to it. As I suggested, people have theories about human nature. A couple of years ago, an American neoconservative writer characterized the difference between political tendencies in the United States in the following way. Liberals believe in the peaceful and cooperative nature of mankind. When confronted with aggression and violence, they tend to assume it is motivated by a just cause, such as socioeconomic deprivation or exploitation by foreigners. Less innocently, conservatives know that evil lurks in men's hearts. So, just for starters, you might consider whether you think human nature can be characterized in terms of immutable characteristics like good and evil. Quite a lot of how you understand policy in general and foreign affairs in particular may ride on that. If you think there is good and evil in the world, you will very likely take policy positions that are somewhat different from those who think that there is actually not really good and evil. There are circumstances which impel people to behave in certain ways. So you should think about those kinds of questions. If you were to take an international relations course anywhere in the United States today, debates within and among the three schools of thought that are described in the readings, realist, liberal, and idealist or constructivist, would be the principal content of the course. Now keep in mind, as I suggested before, that this is technical language. Liberals are not necessarily unrealistic people, nor are realists without ideals. But these are labels for particular ways of understanding how the world works. Realists like Henry Kissinger, for example, or perhaps in her early days, Condoleezza Rice, look at international relations as comprised of states competing to survive in a lawless world. Oh, sure, there's international law, but it doesn't really determine how states interact with each other, say the realists. The competition uses war and threats of war to prevent other states from aggrandizing power at the expense of the state in question. For realists, in other words, there are the unit of analysis is the state, and the states are competing with each other. IR is sometimes, international relations is sometimes called a game of nations, as states try to predict each other's moves, balance against or ally with more powerful states, maintain their own position, or the stability of the system. Although realists need not see the world in terms of good and evil, and in fact I would argue that most do not, they do share a predisposition to see the world as a struggle among essentially immutable competitors. Liberals, by contrast, and it is a pretty remarkable contrast, although many people slide into shades of gray, there are pure realists and pure liberals, if you will, like Madeleine Albright or Tony Blair, see states interacting on many more grounds than merely survival and anarchy, And those other grounds, things like economic links, normative or ideological commonalities, the transatlantic alliance, a common interest in prosperity or a commitment to democratic values, these all mitigate conflict and promote cooperation, say the liberals. So that they'll start with states in the same way that the realists do. But then they'll say, but there are other kinds of relationships, not just relationships of competition, that will shape how the states interact with each other. Some liberals actually see some of these other dynamics, economic or normative relations, for example, as equally, perhaps more important than the state in providing an explanatory variable, in providing an explanation of how the world is working. And they hold out the possibility of change. So liberals are much more inclined to see mutability in the system. That there is particularly not only a possibility of change, but they tend to be optimistic. This change is for the better. So you have to think to yourself of whether you think that's plausible or not. Constructivists, of whom there has been no Secretary of State yet, although, read the article by Robert Jervis carefully, Condoleezza Rice in her latter years might qualify. But constructivists may be represented, for example, by Kofi Annan and his tenure at the United Nations, where state behavior was seen more and more as shaped by prevailing definitions of the state and state sovereignty and power, among other things. Neither the state nor the citizen is natural, the default condition of humankind, nor necessarily the building block of international society. And both realists and liberals would argue that those are the building blocks of international society, differing as they do on what that society is like and what the dynamics of that society is. The constructivists would argue not necessarily, perhaps now, but not always. John Ruggie, special advisor to Kofi Annan and one-time dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, advocated for the UN's new global compact by arguing, and I quote, "We need to devise a broadly acceptable concept of corporate citizenship in the global community," arguing, in other words, that the private sector was becoming more important in this international society and that corporations were becoming, if not as important as states, certainly important players like states. If we can devise new concepts, if we can introduce new players into this game of nations, then it is a very mutable system. It's not just that things can get better, but things can change completely. The name of the game, the players at the game, everything can be altered. Whether it's calling it a war on terror or calling it corporate citizenship, the world is a very malleable place. Now, most conventional international relations theorists in the United States are born of the realist tradition. And you will be reading several summaries or overviews of these schools of thought by people who would describe themselves as essentially realists, dismissing the radical critiques as having been shown wanting with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and quick to conclude that realism, or sometimes neorealism, still, despite the changes in the world over the last decade or so, reigns supreme. In these assessments, they, as I suggested, reflect the American academic establishment consensus, a consensus that's still profoundly shaped by the Cold War. Keep in mind that virtually all of the theorists working in these paradigms, just about everyone making policy today, was brought up and trained during the Cold War. So their experience is vastly different from yours. And one of the things that you should think about is the extent to which there is continuing to be, in this literature that you're going to be reading, the contemporary literature, an overhang of the Cold War. Yet, as Robert Jervis suggests, perhaps the Bush administration's policy and the debates that have raged around it reflect genuinely novel, genuinely post-Cold War schools of thought. For whatever else we may think of the Bush administration policy, it may have been unmoored from the Cold War. Bush's aspiration to, as Jervis puts it, remake the system, not in the hegemon, that is in the American interest, but in the hegemon's image, is a new way of conceptualizing the rights and responsibilities of the world's great power. By realist standards, this is not only quite mutable, but once we have decided that the image is as important as the interest, we're moving toward a constructivist position. Now, this clearly, in some respects, has echoes of the past. It borrows from imperialism, as Pfaff and others have pointed out, in its civilizing mission, and from the conservatives who divide the world into good and evil. But from the liberal conviction that democracy promotes peace, and from the constructive principle that, at least among the good, the world is as we make it, it borrows from very, very disparate contemporary perspectives. So while tyrannies may be immutably evil, as far as the Bush administration policy has gone, change for the better is nonetheless possible in the promotion of democracy. And that, in turn, is not merely the prerogative, but the responsibility of world leadership. But because it is in the interest of the world's hegemon, that is the United States, but because it is morally right by American lights. So these arguments, the pro and con of the Bush administration policy, are variants of and build upon underlying debates about the character not only of the world order, the relations among states, the primacy of states and so forth, but about human nature itself, about whether you think human beings are driven by an unchangeable good or evil quality, or whether they are mutable. Next week, we're going to be turning to the origins of some of these ideas in Western political theory as we leap into some of the most difficult reading of the semester. In the meantime, however, I hope that you will enjoy debating these kinds of questions in your section meetings. And with that, I will stop and take any questions that there are, and then we can move on. Thank you.